They say that if you are ever lost in the woods, stranded in the wilderness, if you are out and in trouble anywhere, experts say the first thing to look for is shelter. Some place to get out of the elements, out of the rain and the wind and the snow and the cold, some place to be safe and protected, to look for shelter. And that makes sense, right? Because they say that we can live for 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, but in a bad situation, only 3 hours without shelter. We are not very well equipped for this world, are we? We don't have the fur coat. We don't have the scales. We don't have the claws. We don't have the fangs. We don't have the cool thing like spider silk or all of these things that other creatures have in order to survive in this world. We're very poorly equipped. What we have is a brain that knows if you're in trouble, look for shelter. Create a lean-to, dig a cave in the snow, find a notch in the hillside where you can be sheltered, safe. The first thing to look for is shelter. So maybe it's no surprise that of all the images for God that are in the Bible, it is that notion of God as our shelter that seems to appear more often than many. God our shelter, God our refuge, God our fortress, God our habitation, God our living space. That one that we can turn to when we are feeling lost or threatened or afraid. God is our we just sang it, right? It was in our psalm today. You just sang a moment ago. I want to make sure I get the words right. We sang, "My refuge and my stronghold, my God in whom I put my trust." It's all over the Bible, all over the Psalms, and as Lutherans, that should probably feel pretty comfortable. Because one of the things about us is we're the folks who love to sing, "A mighty fortress is our God." God our fortress, God our refuge, God our strength, God our hiding place, God our castle moat, surrounded by a moat and high towers. And you'll even notice on the front of your bulletin that the image we have today is a drawing of the Wartburg Castle in Germany. This is the castle where Luther hid out for 3 years because there were people who wanted to kill him. And they spirited him away, kidnapped him away to this castle, and hid him there for 3 years as he grew a beard so nobody would recognize him. And then he worked on translating the Bible. Now, it's not too hard to imagine a few years later when Luther sat down to write A Mighty Fortress, is this picture that you have on your front cover maybe what he had in mind, right? God as the impregnable fortress, the castle to which we can flee when the enemies come, the place we get spirited away to when everything is falling apart. God, our refuge, our fortress, our God, our strength and hiding place. But I was thinking about that picture on the front of your bulletin, and this notion, we have it on our wall up here too, God our refuge, God our fortress. And thinking about Israel, where the people who wrote the Psalms lived. Because they didn't necessarily have the big castle like that. The people who wrote the Psalms were farmers, shepherds. They raised grapes and things like that. And they lived in land where what they needed more than a big castle like on the front of your bulletin, as they really needed a place to get away to when the wild animals showed up. And you don't want to run all the way back to the castle. You need something much more immediate. And the words that are behind the psalm that we sang have as one of their roots the high places. And if an animal's coming after you, isn't that where you'd go? Up into the hills, where the rocks are, to find a cave, a little overhang, a spot where you can be out of the elements, but also to be able to hold back the enemies and the animals that are coming after you. God, our refuge. The crack in the rocks where we can hide away and be safe. Perhaps this is another way we can think about God as God providing refuge along with us, because that is God's promise. Not that God is going to whisk us away, but that God is with us in the wilderness. And after all, look what happened to Jesus today. Jesus out in the wilderness, 40 days without eating. I guarantee Jesus was hungry. And when the devil says, hey, why don't you go ahead and turn that into McDonald's Big Mac? Jesus was tempted to do so. Right? So, and then the second two, the devil actually quotes our psalm today. But it's interesting because what the devil is doing is he's misunderstanding, deliberately misunderstanding the promise here, the false promises of the devil. When we think that God as our fortress, God as our stronghold, God as our castle, it sounds like nothing bad is ever going to get to us, but we know that's not the truth. Instead, what we have is the promise that God is in the middle of it all with us, in the wilderness with us. So the devil, with his false promises, misreads this understanding and says, well, if God is your fortress, then surely nothing bad is ever going to happen to you. When the proper promise is, God's going to be right with you. So God, our shelter, our crack in the rock where we can hide, right there in the midst of the wilderness with us, God is our habitation. The one we can turn to when everything else has fallen apart. Maybe you've heard the story of the two little girls in California. They were sisters, ages 8 and 5. Their favorite thing to do in all the world was to go hiking and exploring in the woods behind their house. And on this particular day, not too long ago, they were outside in the backyard getting ready, and Mom was finishing up chores inside, and the girls were hollering for Mom, Mom, let's go, come on, hurry up. And Mom said, no, I'm not quite ready yet. Just wait for me. I'll be out in a minute. Well, they didn't want to wait. They were too excited, and they knew these woods, so they set off together. Following trails that were very familiar in these woods, that branched then into trails that were a little bit less familiar, that branched into trails that were even less familiar, that branched to animal trails that they had never seen before, until they realized there was nothing familiar in view. They were lost in the woods. But these little girls, ages 8 and 5, were in 4-H. And it so happens that in 4-H, they had a meeting not long ago where they taught them wilderness survival skills. And they taught them, when you are lost in the woods, the first thing you look for is shelter. Get out of the elements. Get under something. Get safe and get small. And that's what they did. They found a bush, a huckleberry bush. They crawled underneath it, and that is where they stayed for the next 44 hours. They spent the night there, huddled under the younger sister's rain jacket, telling each other stories and trying to think of things they could picture in their mind that would be happy thoughts, drinking water from the leaves of the bush that they called their huckleberry home. The little girl, the younger sister, cried all night because she was scared. The older sister stayed awake so that she could keep watch. And they stayed in one place, because that's another thing they taught them. Stay in one place, get shelter, and wait. Now, each day, the search parties grew. By the second day, it had grown to 270 people, 2 helicopters, a dozen teams of dogs, a small plane, a heat-seeking drone, which I thought sounded really cool. People everywhere combing these woods, looking for them. It was two firefighters that had come in from out of town and were at the outskirts of the search area who noticed some tracks on the ground and decided to follow them, hollering and shouting, looking for these girls, and they heard a voice that said, "We're right here." And they found them. They couldn't see them because they were under their huckleberry bush. And the girls are okay. Took them to the hospital. They're dehydrated, tired. They lost their voices from shouting for people. But there under the bush, there lost in the wilderness, they were together. And their own hugs and presents, the shelter that was over them, was there with them as everything fell apart. God is our refuge. God is our shelter. God is our dwelling place. God our habitation. God our huckleberry home. Thanks be to God.